God of Moses had also revealed itself to the Greeks, only they had taken it in a different direction, more rational and philosophical, while his people, of course, had the higher and more personal understanding of this as Judaism's particular relationship to God. In his view, the Logos was an intermediary between the ultimate divine reality and the sensible world. And though the Logos was not God, it was God's first begotten, responsible for God's work in creation. Thus, always and everywhere, the Logos, or wisdom, pervades the whole of creation. Since in Ecclesiastes, I think it's Ecclesiastes, anyway, chapter 24, verse 3, wisdom is identified as God's creative spirit, for Philo at least, there seemed to be no division between God's wisdom and spirit. Interestingly, however, God's wisdom is not personified as masculine, but as feminine, Sophia. It seems for the Hebrews and early Christians, God was always masculine, which is why only sons could be heirs or equals. That whole idea of father-son. Philo makes absolutely clear the Creator God is masculine, and so too God's wisdom is masculine. He says, the feminine always falls short and is inferior to the masculine, which has priority. He even went so far as to say women had to become men if they wanted any spiritual status with God. Perhaps this is why he was never clear on the relation of the philosopher's Logos with his scriptures personified feminine wisdom. But since the latter was scriptural and the former philosophical, he made wisdom superior to Logos, telling us, quote, Logos serves as God for the yet unenlightened, end quote. For the philosophers, that is. The philosophers, of course, would have scoffed at any idea of a gendered Logos. For them, the Logos totally transcended any notion of gender. Footnote 2. Although Philo virtually condemns any anthropomorphic notion of God, he is sympathetic with man's anthropomorphic expressions for God. For what else, he asks, does man have to go on? Language, after all, is only human, so no use apologizing for it. For Philo, the Logos expressed creation as the thought and will of God, the cosmic governing and generative principle immanent and active in all reality. The Logos stands between and separates the creature from the Creator. Quote, and I stood between the Lord and you, neither unbegotten as God or begotten as you, but midway between the two extremes, serving as a pledge for both. The Logos is also our heavenly nourishment, raining upon you bread out of heaven. Quote, the holy chalice of its own reason, the cupbearer of God and toastmaster of the feast, who differs not from the draught he pours. Maybe it's draft, D-R-A-U-G-H-T. I have no idea how to pronounce that word. But is himself the undiluted drink, the gaiety, the effusion and cheer, the ambrosian drug of joy and gladness, end quote. These are but a few of the exalted views of Philo's Logos. Right here, a beautiful foreshadowing of the Christian Eucharist. And just as the, quote, shadow or image of God is the instrument of creation, the Logos in turn is the image and archetype of all things created, end quote. In all of literature, there is perhaps no more wonderful understanding of the Logos. Though this no doubt played a great part in the earliest understanding of Christ's divinity, quote, in the beginning was the Logos and the Logos was God, end quote, it was lost to the Christian public, obscured by the Father's language, expressions, and personified images of the Trinity as Father and Son, two males, of course. Without going into Plato's notion of idea or image, all creation being the image, idea, form, or shadow of some transcendent ideal, Philo regarded the Logos as God's image and the medium of God's creation. Quote, the shadow of God is his Logos, which he used like an instrument when he was making the world. And this shadow is, as it were, the model, the archetype of other things, end quote. Every man, in regard to his intellect, is connected with the divine Logos, being an impression of it, a fragment or ray of that blessed nature. Quote, "The image of God is the Logos through which the whole universe was framed. The divine Logos is himself the image of God, chiefest of all beings intellectually perceived, placed nearest with no intermediary distance to the truly existent one. It well befits those who have entered into comradeship with knowledge to desire to see the existent, if they may, but if they cannot, to see at least his image, the most holy Logos." A quote from Philo. He speaks of suddenly seeing the Logos, the place of God, he calls it. That the Logos is the image of God and that humans were made in the image of God means they are made in the image of the Logos. Quote, "When the divine breath was breathed into his face," end quote. The very same understanding Christianity would incorporate as its own. It would be the incarnation of the Logos, however, understood as Christ, that would become the image in which all men were created in the image of Christ, the oneness of God and man. Marginalia, pre-veil of consciousness. Back to the text. Like the biblical account of God's wisdom, however, Philo's Logos is utterly personal to God and man, not the more aloof-sounding Logos of the Stoics. So, in keeping with Hebrew scripture, where God and Logos' wisdom is consistently personified, Philo also personified the Greek Logos, all but incarnated it, which the Stoics would never have thought proper or possible. In its more philosophical setting, of course, the Logos was never personified. To the Greeks, this would have made the Logos a god, a myth, rejected by the philosophers. So, there were differences in the understanding of biblical wisdom and the more philosophical Logos. Yet the terms were close enough for Philo, at least, to use an explanation for God's presence and activity in creation, a reference that would speak to both Jew and Gentile. Philo tells us of the cornerstone of Heraclitus' notion of unity, quote, was the oneness of opposites, the hidden harmony, quote. He says, quote, "It is better than the visible, the fairest harmony results from differences. It is the tension of opposing forces that makes the structure one. The interchange of opposites with one another is itself proof they are only different manifestations of the same thing, the changeless unity in which all multiplicity inheres. Logos is the substance that creates, sustains, and in the end perhaps reabsorbs into itself. The one is all, and the all is one," end quote. Apart from this, quote, "union of opposites," being an apt definition of Christ, his saying the one is all and the all is one is no doubt the genesis of Paul's notion that in the end, after all is saved, God will be all in all, meaning all will be one. As we'll see, however, this saying of Paul was the cause of division among the fathers. Before moving on, it is worth going over Philo's remark that his Judaic wisdom was superior to the philosopher's Logos. Thus he says, quote, "Logos serves as God for the yet unenlightened," end quote. After his exalted and wonderful exposition of the Logos, this statement is curious. Obviously, he was not above adhering to the traditional Judaic party line. He does not want to be accused of adding anything to the proverbial Judaic understanding of God. His comment, however, serves the Logos in another way. In the history of religion, man's first encounter with God has always been through the cosmos or in nature. Thus, it is even true for most people today. Indeed, the cosmic Logos is God's first revelation of itself to mankind, the mystery of God in creation. While this is a piece of revelation in itself, it is not, however, the ultimate or final revelation of God. So in this matter, Philo had it right. There is more to God than the Logos' omnipresence in creation, which more is the Trinity. God's three major revelations